I want to thank you all for coming today. This is an extraordinary event, and it follows on what was, unfortunately, one of the greatest days of infamy for those of us who study Congress and who have worked in Congress and, in my view, care about our Constitution. January 6th, hopefully, will never be repeated. But out of January 6 ashes came an extraordinary set of hearings in the last year about what exactly happened in the Capitol to people who were inspired to attack national monuments. We owe a great debt to the members of the January 6 committee, particularly those who put America above party alliance, such as Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, and to the chairman, Benny Thompson, for running what, in my experience, was one of the most extraordinary hearings ever held by Congress. I first came to Washington as a baby lawyer. I wasn't even 30 years old, and I sat behind a man named Arthur Lyman on the Iran-Contra investigation. And however much I love Arthur, I have to say those hearings did not work out so well. I learned some things from that, and I just want to give profound thanks to the Levin Center for proposing this. They have done all the work here. I get to give you some lunch in a room and welcome you all to Georgetown. But they have set up an extraordinary, along with Jim Townsend, Elise Bean, they have organized an extraordinary panel. I'm really happy to see my friend Lisa Desjardins. We spent too much time on PBS talking about some impeachments. And so now I'm going to give it over to Jim, who will introduce our star-studded cast so that we can learn what happened behind the curtain in the January 6 hearings. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Professor Norris. I'm Jim Townsend. I'm the director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy. And before I introduce our wonderful panel and talk about the program, I just want to say a word about the Levin Center and the work that we do and why we think this conversation is so significant. Senator Levin founded the Levin Center upon his retirement from the U.S. Senate in 2015. And our mission is to advance bipartisan, fact-based oversight and civic discourse as fundamental elements of our democracy. You know, we do workshops and trainings on Capitol Hill with staff, sometimes with members, and with lawmakers around the country and state legislatures. We also do scholarship and commentary in the press and in the courts. And we do this not just to honor Carl, who passed away in 2021, and we miss him dearly, but we do this because it's so important for the public to understand how important congressional oversight is to our democracy and to our ability to evolve as a society and solve problems. I like to quote some words from the Supreme Court that date back to 1953 in an opinion, United States v. Rumley, and the court said, Congress, when it engages in oversight, becomes, quote, the eyes and voice of the American people, unquote. How do we know what we know? Well, very often there was a hearing or there was a report from Congress or from one of its state counterparts bringing those facts to light and enabling America to move forward. And so we're here to talk about a very, very significant example of congressional oversight and get into not the substance so much. There are other places to do that, but to talk about the process, about how they did the work and what it means for future congressional investigations. I want to say just that we really are, well, first of all, I thank Georgetown Law Center. We really appreciate the venue and the partnership. We hope to do many more things together. I'm going to talk about the program just briefly. We're going to start with a lightning round. I'm going to ask each member to say a few words about what they thought about the work of the committee, how it did its work, and then we're going to get into some specific questions. And then at about 1:00, let's see, we have some microphones available for the public to be able to, for folks here to, I thought we had some microphones that were going to be, they're on their way. Okay. Because at about 1:00, if you have questions of your own, we would welcome you to come and ask some questions of our distinguished panel. So let me get to our panelists. And I'm going to just go in alphabetical order here. Kristen Ammerling was Deputy Staff Director and Chief Counsel for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. She's had a distinguished career in public service and in the private sector. I'm just going to summarize briefly. She was Deputy General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Transportation. She has served as Chief Counsel for the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. She served a similar role in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and she was Director of Oversight in the Senate Commerce Committee. To her right, Reg Brown. He is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Kirkland and Ellis, where his practice focuses on crisis management and government investigations. He represented, I think, several witnesses who were called before the Select Committee. He previously served in the White House counsel's office, where he was the principal legal liaison to the Departments of Treasury and Housing and Urban Development. To his right is Lisa Desjardins. Lisa is a correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. And we're so thrilled to have her with us. She covers the U.S. Capitol, and she travels across the country to report on how decisions in Washington affect people around the country. For her reporting on the before and after, the events of the January 6th insurrection, she received a Peabody Award as well as several other significant awards. And then finally, on the far right is Dave Rapallo. Dave joined the faculty at Georgetown Law Center after spending 2 decades in high-level positions in Congress and the White House. He was staff director of the House Oversight and Reform Committee. He also served as in the Obama White House as senior director and counsel on legislative oversight for the National Security Council. And Dave is the 2022 recipient of the Carl Levin Center Award for Excellence in Oversight Research. So that is our panel. So to kick things off, and I'm going to sit down as we get into because I can't stand up for 90 minutes, I suppose I could. But what I'd like to do with the panel to start is sort of a lightning round where, and maybe just sticking with alphabetical for now, I ask you to just take a couple of minutes to just give some general remarks about the work of the January 6th Committee. Again, the process as opposed to the substance, what was new and different, what worked, what didn't, and how might the committee's actions affect oversight, congressional oversight in the future? So, Kristen, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you, Jim, and many thanks to the team at Georgetown Law and the Levin Center for the invitation to appear today. And good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I just want to note that my remarks here today are my personal views and don't reflect the official position of the January 6th Committee. So that said, I'd like to kick things off by offering one overarching comment about the way that the Select Committee conducted oversight. Many of the procedures that the Select Committee used to present its findings to the American public that have been characterized as new or different, like designating 1 or 2 members only to ask witnesses questions in a long block of time at hearings, actually are tools that have long been in the toolkit of congressional oversight committees in both the House and the Senate. But the foundational feature of the Select Committee's work that enabled use of these procedures was the commitment across the entire committee's membership to work collaboratively to advance their investigative goal, which was to uncover what happened on January 6th, why it happened, and to make recommendations to make sure something like that never happens again. And this took a lot of elbow grease. The committee was comprised of 9 members with widely differing political perspectives, from very liberal Democrat to very conservative Republican. They came from different parts of the country. They had different types of expertise and experience, but they succeeded in reaching agreement on how to advance their oversight goals. And this took a lot of work. Democracy takes work, and this committee was willing to do that work. It required tireless, skilled leadership by the committee chair. It required continuing, courageous, focused leadership by the vice chair. And across the entire membership of all 9 members, it involved a commitment to ongoing, respectful conversations with each other, a spirit of accommodation, and a willingness to put the overarching goals of the committee above individual egos. And as a result, the committee, through this collaborative approach, had some flexibility in how it presented information to the public. For example, members did not insist on exercising their right to ask 5-minute rounds of questions with witnesses in every hearing. So I think in terms of the takeaway on implications for future oversight, that the committee's success serves as an example of the possibilities of oversight when members are working collaboratively with seriousness of purpose. And I look forward to discussing these and other issues with the panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'd agree with Kristen that it was extraordinary and it was a success, and that many of the tools that were used were not new. They were novel in the way in which they were pulled together. I think it was a select committee, and in many respects, the committee selected the best approaches to oversight that have been used by past committees. One way in which it did feel novel to me as a defense lawyer, and just for the perspective of defense lawyers, I did not think the Iran-Contra hearing went poorly. Sort of the response of Brendan Sullivan about being a potted plant was fairly extraordinary, and for defense lawyers, we all felt like, wow, one of our guys actually won one for once. But here, I thought the one thing that was pretty novel was it was bipartisan in composition, in the sense of there were people on it from the left to the right, but it was organized under rules that did not give the minority party the full discretion that it normally enjoys to pick its own members. And I think that'll have some interesting long-term implications that are worth discussing later. Having said that, it was extraordinarily effective, both in terms of telling a story and in driving action in other forms. Again, as a defense lawyer, I approach this thinking not only about the work of the January 6th committee, but about DOJ inquiries, bar inquiries, the Court of Public Opinion, and the like, which all sort of flowed from that. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about some of those issues as well.
Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Desjardins, and I am incredibly honored to be here with this very esteemed panel that you are meeting now, but whose reputations are very well known on and off the Hill. So it's quite an honor to be here and to be talking about this. I was so interested, my ears perked up when Jim said the word process and stressed that this is about the process. Usually in our newsroom, whenever I pitch, let's do a story about process, guys. Almost immediately everyone is thinking, okay, we will listen to her and then say no, because that sounds terrible. But I really think of the process in Congress, in covering Congress. Just stick with me for a second here. As sort of like a race car, honestly. I think it is sexy. I think it is the decision about how Congress will move forward, where it goes, the style, the tone. And I think of it as sexy and important, like a race car. And I think that what this committee did was unprecedented in a number of levels, many of which, as we're saying, we will continue to feel, and we're feeling now. At the top of my list as a reporter were the decisions by then Speaker Pelosi to reject 2 Republican members, and then by then Leader McCarthy to not seat the remaining 3 Republicans. That had effects in multiple directions. One, of course, and we may talk about this later, was that you had a committee that was incredibly cohesive. which is rare. The point of Congress is to be deliberative, to almost like a courtroom, to have two sides that just represent their sides. But here you had a committee that had a sense of greater purpose. That's why they felt they were there. And they were able to unify. And from that stemmed all these other, I think, innovations, many of which involve the media and the decision by the members and the focus on not just the final report, but in telling it in a way that would change not just the pages of history, which I think the committee paid a lot of attention to, but hearts and minds now. And this was a committee, and I can speak a lot about my reporting, what people have told me that I feel confident in who've worked on this. They really were thinking about Republicans and independents in this country that they think didn't understand the danger from the committee's point of view of what happened on January 6th. And so from that, then they said, let's use video. Let's tell this story in new ways. Let's hire producers from ABC to make this congressional hearing something that is compelling as the subject matter we feel it should be. So that's where you see, so Iran-Contra, which did, I think, captivate the country fairly until a point when then I think then my understanding is the networks then were losing their ratings and then sort of all traded who would actually be airing the Iran-Contra hearings versus, say, let's go back even farther, 1912, the Titanic hearings, which I think were sort of one of the most electrifying kinds of hearings that Congress ever had. Those were only a month long, 86 witnesses, Iran-Contra, about 100 witnesses. Here we're talking about 1,000 witnesses and just a deep amount of material that they put in a modern way to be engaging. It did create challenges for the press in how to cover it because we did not know what we would be seeing in each hearing. We didn't know what kind of material, and we had a short time frame to then understand it and present it for our audiences and also check it, and get responses from people who a clip of them may be shown. Do you think that accurately presented what your testimony was? So there was a challenge for us, but there's no doubt in my mind that the way the committee did that was very important. And going forward, I think we will see that in positives be mimicked. And I think we also still see those reverberating, you can't be on this committee because you took our people off your committee. I think that did not begin with this, but it continues, and this aided in that idea of you versus us on committee assignments.
Great. Thank you also to the Levin Center, and welcome to Georgetown Law. I agree with, I think, all the panelists in terms of the bipartisanship and the hard work that the members put into this process being responsible for their ability to have these innovations. As Kristen mentioned, maybe I can give a little more context. The House normally operates under the 5-minute rule. So you go on one side and then you have another side disjointed and go back and forth for the whole hearing. For years, the committee's rules have allowed for extended questioning, but it's rarely used because members really want their 5 minutes and they're reluctant to give it up. The January 6th committee members were able to put that aside and take advantage of the innovations. However, just to bookend a couple of the points, to a little more context, I believe Leader McCarthy made some critical decisions that contributed to this outcome. First, after the January 6th attack, there was widespread support for a 9/11 style commission, including from Leader McCarthy, who had three conditions: an even number of members, equal treatment on subpoenas, and no predetermined outcomes. Democrats agreed with that. And John Katko, Republican, negotiated the bipartisan legislation with Benny Thompson. But the day before it came to a vote on the House floor, Leader McCarthy reversed himself and opposed it. It still passed the House with Congressman Katko and 34 other Republicans, but it died in the Senate. Second, when the House then established the Select Committee, McCarthy's second decision was to offer 2 members of his 5-member slate that had conflicts or had made statements opposing the whole mission of the Select Committee. And he did this after meeting with Officer Michael Fanone, who pleaded with him not to put what he called obstructionists on the panel. When Speaker Pelosi rejected those 2 members, Leader McCarthy's third decision was to pull his entire slate of 5 members. Speaker Pelosi had already named Liz Cheney. She then added Adam Kinzinger, and this allowed the committee to operate with the common purpose that we all saw. Just to close this point, the result should have been foreseeable. In 2005, House Republicans set up the Hurricane Katrina Select Committee. Back then, Democrats didn't join because of what they viewed as an inadequate scope for that Select Committee. But several Democrats from the region participated anyway, given the Republican chair at the time, Tom Davis, bipartisan support. Finally, fast forward to the Benghazi Select Committee. Democrats were having an internal debate about whether to join since there had already been 7 or 8 previous investigations. And as Adam Schiff wrote in his book, he argued for the boycott, while my old boss, Elijah Cummings, argued that Democrats should participate. Ultimately, Democrats decided to participate. And as Congressman Schiff mentions in his book, after that internal debate, Speaker Pelosi then appointed him to the Benghazi Committee, which he said he wasn't sure whether it was a punishment or a reward. However, after he went through the entire process, being on the inside of that investigation, he said in the book that Pelosi and Cummings had been right. So I think that's part of the reason you see now Democrats are all going to be joining these new Republican select committees that they're setting up in the House. Thanks.
Well, thank you all. Those are really insightful comments and setting us up really for a great conversation. So we're going to shift back and forth between talking about the investigation and talking about the hearings, but I'm going to ask a question about the hearings at this point and pick up on the point that was made about how scripted the hearings were. So, Kristen, I'd like to start with you. You were on the inside, as part of the team that was guiding this whole process. How difficult was it to create those kinds of conditions where members were willing to accept having such a strict script where there was a limited amount of opportunity for members to speak, and 2 members or 1 member was really driving the process on any particular hearing? Was that really hard? And in an environment where there might be more political division or more or less consensus, let's say about mission, would that be impossible to replicate?
Well, I think, as I said in the beginning, that there was quite a bit of diversity on the select committee, with members ranging from the conservative Republican to liberal Democrat, and working collaboratively is a day-to-day process that takes work. But across the political spectrum of the committee, the members were focused on their shared goal of getting the facts right. And that collaborative spirit enabled them to present their narrative and the facts and have the dialogue with the American public about their findings in a unified way. I will say, as Dave has touched upon in his opening remarks, there are a number of House and Senate rules that give members the opportunity to express opposing views at congressional hearings and in other phases of congressional oversight. For example, the rule that we've already talked about, but which is central, that provides an essential right at hearings, is that every member has the right to ask at least 5 minutes worth of questions to witnesses that are before the committee. It's true in the House and it's true in the Senate. There's some variations in the Senate, but there are similar rules. If every single member of a committee took their 5 minutes to express views that were divergent from each other, there would be a very disjointed presentation of the information at a given hearing. Another example is the House deposition regulation provision, which says that if the ranking minority member on a committee objects to the release of information from a deposition, which is presumptively confidential, then if the chairman of the committee wants to override that objection, the ranking member can force a committee vote in order to release deposition material. Well, if a committee is trying to structure a hearing around presenting excerpts from different depositions, it could be pretty cumbersome to face the need to have full committee votes in order to release material. I think there are many occasions where it's important, effective, and in the public interest for members to assert some or all of these rights, depending on the circumstances. In the case of the Select Committee, members were working collaboratively and were able to present their findings in a unified way.
Other panelists, you want to chime in on this? Were you surprised by what transpired in terms of, the way the hearings were run?
I thought it was very effective for telling certain aspects of the story that needed to be told. So I thought the committee did an extraordinary job of figuring out what was going on in the executive branch that gave rise to the rally on the plaza and the march on the Capitol, and the extraordinary level of anger that was felt by some of the people who participated in that. I thought they also did an amazing job of telling the story of how close we came to losing aspects of our democracy and having the government sort of crumble. And the only way to do that was by limiting the number of speakers and focusing on particular parts of the narrative through the use of video and live in-person testimony. There probably were some aspects of what happened that are important that maybe are told in the final report, but were not told publicly. I think probably the area where I feel like, and I may be in a minority here in terms of thinking this, the security story of the Capitol and whether there was more that could have been done to safeguard the Capitol from what came, I think probably suffered a bit. But there were only so many stories that could be told, and I thought they did an extraordinarily effective job of doing that. And they divvied it up, so even though everybody didn't get 5 minutes every time, I think each of the members got a chance to lead part of the storytelling, and that was a very clever and appropriate compromise.
Yeah, this was an incredibly made-for-TV series of hearings. You know, as a congressional reporter, you know, I often get dinner party jokes about, you know, oh, so such great television, congressional hearings, you know. But this is a case where it was, and it was the use of compelling video and very carefully scripted wording, which was tailored to each member, I think, and driven by each member. And I also think that this committee was able to do something unique in that by choosing different themes and establishing one kind of captain member in charge of that theme for most of the themes, it was almost as if they were establishing subcommittees of one for each topic. And that really allowed an incredible amount of cohesion to that topic, focus, and the member driving it was able to put it in their own words in a way, know the script, and use the sound bites that they thought were most important. So it wasn't just made for TV, it was also made for social media. And so it was just, I think, one of the most savvy committees in terms of tackling a huge topic that you could see. And because of that, you know, there really wasn't much discussion of what wasn't on the table, which I agree with the security, what happened with police, what happened with the Pentagon. Those are certainly mentioned in the report. But if you look at the recommendations, I think there's like 12 recommendations. It really is not the heart of what this committee was about. They were focused on former President Trump throughout. And so because of that focus and because they did it in such an engaging way, it really wasn't noticed what was left out. But, you know, you can't cover everything, and it's part of my job to talk about that too.
Yeah, I would say I worked on the Hill for 20 years. I don't know how many hearings I participated in or witnessed or whatever, hundreds for sure. And my opinion was these hearings were among the most compelling and effective at, one, getting out the evidence that the committee collected, and then two, the findings that were based on that evidence. And it really was effective. And in some ways, it had to be a little scripted because there was so much evidence that they were disclosing at every single hearing. You know, they had done about a year before these hearings took place and did 1,000 interviews, and they had all this information they were trying to disclose. So just logistically, it had to be somewhat scripted to get the information out. I was going back and watching some of the hearings, and for one, I counted, and there were over 100 video clips, scenes from the Capitol, tweets, letters, all of that in a 2-hour hearing. But even with that, I would say, as I watched, just as a person on the outside, I still thought there were moments that were surprising to me as I watched, like when Rusty Bowers was testifying about and got really choked up about how the president had asked him to violate his oath that he had taken before God, and that was something he could not do. I mean, that was really compelling. Or when Cassidy Hutchinson testified about how she walked into the office of Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, with scenes of violence on the TV screens, and he was staring blankly down at his phone because he already knew that the president didn't want to do anything. And so those moments in the hearings were surprising to me, and I thought very compelling.
That's important. It was scripted, but it wasn't inauthentic. People, the witnesses were not scripted. I mean, they knew what the general questions were going to be. And in some instances, video was used, but the words that they chose were their own. They just sort of knew what the topic was in advance. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that scripted means a sort of fake narrative that wasn't authentic or wasn't true. It was true, but only as to the topics that were covered.
I think what these hearings reveal more than any others I've ever seen is the reality that in most cases the hearings are not about gathering new information. The hearings are about relaying the information that has already been discovered by the committee and its staff. A lot of times people will focus on a revelation that comes out in a hearing. They think that people didn't know about that. Members of the committee didn't know about that before it was publicly put out there. But there are a few exceptions to that rule. But even, the famous revelation about the tapes, there's some previous discussions that took place before that was actually in the public domain. Reg, I want to stay with you for a minute and ask about sort of switching over to the witnesses. The norm in most hearings is that witnesses are given an opportunity to give an opening statement. That's contemplated in the rules. But here, in a lot of cases, that did not happen. Although there were a couple of exceptions to that where people were allowed to give sort of lengthy remarks. What do you think about that approach? You've represented a lot of people in front of congressional committees. And do you think that sort of approach will be adopted more widely?
I hope it won't be adopted more widely, because in most hearings, it's 5 minutes on either side, and the only time the witness gets to tell their story is in that opening statement, and I hate to lose that. Here, I think because of the agreements that were reached in advance, there wasn't a sense that the witnesses felt like they would be asked to say something that wasn't true. Their own truths were able to be revealed. We were allowed to submit written statements, which my client did because I cared about additional forms where different parts of the story might play out, and I wanted to make sure there was a record of that. But it was a very reasonable compromise under the circumstances. But in the norm, just as a matter of due process, if a witness is going to have to show up somewhere, you want them to at least have a few minutes to tell their side of the story, particularly if there isn't an agreement. Here, I think most of the people who were willing to testify felt like the committee was being true to their narratives, and so there wasn't a need for that 5 minutes.
Just to add to what Reg said, the committees that appeared, the witnesses that appeared before the select committee were cooperative witnesses. It may be that in a hearing where a witness is a hostile witness, they find that it's more important to make sure that they make a statement up front. So I think the treatment of witnesses goes on a case-by-case basis.
Lisa, I'd like to turn to you now.
Sure.
And again, these sort of innovations, or maybe they're not entirely innovations, but sort of the positives and the negatives, as well as, the implications for the future of what a lot of people commented on was obviously showing excerpts of tape depositions. What is your perspective on that?
I thought it was incredibly effective, and more than that, I think it helped really accentuate the news that was happening in real time in a way that is unusual. We would come into this, all of us had to make decisions, every network, PBS, are we going to show these in real time? Are we going to have it across the country? Are we going to use PBS space? For PBS, we have an incredibly high bar. PBS, I think, was the only national network that did not go to September 11th coverage when that was happening, because we have children's programming, and there was a really strong feeling that needed to be available. We needed a place that families weren't seeing September 11th coverage. So for PBS to put a, especially daytime news event across all of our over 330 stations, which is 100 more than any other network, by the way, is a very, very big decision. And we operate a little bit differently than most networks. We're kind of a co-op more than a network. But anyway, it was a very, very large decision, very high bar for us. And we did the first one and we said, wow, that we learned more than we thought. There were more surprises than we thought. And, every hearing after that, we went into it saying, I think this is going to be the hearing where they fall a little short of expectations, because expectations were high. They kept coming out with really important, engaging, and sometimes scintillating things. And each hearing, except for one, we were remarking at how powerful the material was, that they actually were meeting the expectations, which they had set to be very high. And I think a big part of that was because you were seeing the words of the people who were firsthand witnesses and involved themselves. You were hearing them answering questions in a way that was being accountable to the committee, but the way it was presented was, it was sort of like they were being accountable to the country. And I think that kind of connection using video was very important. On the other hand, I think something that doesn't get talked about, I definitely think you were right, Reg, to point out, these were authentic clips. It wasn't, the witnesses were not scripted. However, the choice of witnesses was something that the committee did. And they were very purposeful in highlighting especially Republican witnesses, again, because they really wanted to get across that this kind of thinking that led to January 6th was something that was rebuked by many Republicans. They wanted to talk to Republicans and independents. However, there were not, say, Republicans who thought differently that were highlighted as witnesses. And that was a choice they made. But because there was not, for both parties contributed to this, because there was not a minority report, there was not that kind of pushback, 5-minute questioning. You saw one flavor of witnesses, many of them, which was itself unusual to have so many Republicans talking about the problems of a president of their party. But it was something that we usually see, and we didn't in these hearings.
Lisa, I have to say something about your point about the news judgment. My first very solid memory of a Washington congressional hearing was something called Watergate, which trumped Sesame Street, as I was a young child, and I was very angry about the fact that I couldn't see Sesame Street.
Exactly.
And this thing called Watergate, and I saw no water and there was no gate. Very frustrating. So I now know.
Yeah, we probably got a letter from you, and that's why we were like,
from my parents, more likely than me.
We've got to be careful. Maybe in the future, not so much. Yes.
Others want to comment?
Let me then move to another thing it's gotten a lot of discussion, and that's sort of the formatting of the hearings, such that they were really presented as documentaries. Each hearing, and Lisa, I thought it was really interesting what you said. Each one, almost like each hearing became the work of an unofficial subcommittee in that respect. But maybe David, with all of your experience, having worked on the Hill for 2 decades and done a lot of hearings, what is your sense of whether that kind of approach is feasible, sort of, in other circumstances? This hasn't been done a lot, if ever, and do you think focusing on one topic or trying to be that narrow is really something that will translate?
Yeah, I mean, first, I thought it was phenomenal in terms of getting like I was saying, the evidence and the findings out there in a compelling way. I think others have said this before, but it's sort of like watching a series that has 2-hour documentaries, right, where you have, the same characters coming through as the members of Congress, and then you have the new witnesses each time. At the beginning of the hearing, there was a recap of what happened last time and a preview of what you're going to hear tonight. At the end of the hearing, there's a recap of what you heard today and what you're going to hear at the next hearing. And I thought it was very efficient in terms of doing that. The challenge is, can you plan it ahead of time? So this, you're right, this has been done before. I know Senator Levin has done it at PSI in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. When Kristen and I worked for Henry Waxman in the fall of 2008, we held a series of hearings on the financial collapse where we brought in Lehman, AIG, the credit rating agencies, the regulators, in a 2-month period. And there are some benefits too, I think, as Lisa was saying, in terms of teams. You could sort of stagger the hearings with different teams, but it's really hard to plan the series while you're doing the investigation. So the big difference, I think, with January 6th is they had a year, and they did all of their, not all of it, but a huge portion of their interviews and their document collection, everything. We're able to plan out that summer and into the fall.
Jim,
go ahead.
I would
Yeah.
say you can do this where there's a general consensus about the facts and who the good guys and the bad guys are, right? In the financial crisis, everybody knew that, the stock market and the economy were in a bad place. And so telling the story about Wall Street's role, there wasn't a huge divide. There was a divide around some issues about root causes. Here, there were, in fact, very different narratives that were out there. We kind of got the kind of mainstream consensus view, but there is still a view on the right that hasn't been shared yet. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether people take outtakes from the videos or the interviews and try to craft an alternative narrative or not. I do think that the hearings move the country a little bit to more of a consensus, but there is another narrative that didn't get told, and you kind of can't do that through the normal give and take of a bipartisan committee where each side gets to pick their own people, because the narratives in general are so far apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and because of that, there is that group of Americans who believes in that narrative that wasn't told, that they see that, and President Trump is inflaming that as evidence that they're right and that they're being shut out, and so it's something that it's a part of politics that fuels itself, and we'll see how the Republican majority in the House handles that and what they do coming up.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I think 4 of the 5 of us are former congressional staffers. And so, I think the implication or our inclination would be to focus a lot on the work the staff does, which is very merited. I can certainly speak to that. But I want to ask about member involvement and the extent to which members played really significant roles, even in the insofar as gathering information. Reg, I know you know something. I mean, everybody knows about this, but as somebody who's represented people before committees, I'd like to ask you about Lynn Cheney and what you've come to understand about her role. All of us know she played a very significant role in gathering certain information, particularly from Cassidy Hutchinson. And in fact, there was an entire hearing devoted to hearing from her that really Liz Cheney was very much a leader of. Can you talk a little bit about what she feels about this and what you've learned about this?
There's an award that's given out, Profiles in Courage award. I don't know if Liz has gotten one yet, but she deserves one because she put her whole career on the line to do what she thought was right, because she felt like democracy was more important. And she did something that, not a lot of members take the time to do. Carl Levin was, of course, the best at it, which is she just dove absolutely deeply into the facts. I remember bringing a witness in for an interview, and the interviews are normally led by staff, and there was Liz Cheney going through questions to get at the facts well beyond where the staffers were. Carl Levin had that gift. He always got his way in hearings by just waiting until everybody else left, and then he would just keep going for hours if necessary until he built the full record. I thought she exhibited extraordinary courage at great personal costs to tell a story that was, I think, very important. Her father was actually a creature of both the Congress and the executive branch, and so I think it probably touched her and her family in a personal way that was different than perhaps it might have touched others, because I think she could have envisioned her father being in the executive branch and running the risk, as Pence did, of having the mob want to hang you, and being in the legislative chamber she probably grew up in, and sort of seeing it desecrated and the like, and it had a profound impact on her. Kristen probably has a better perspective because you watched all of the members and probably saw this.
This is where I
up
lean
front.
and I'm like,
Yeah.
Well, I would just add two notes. I would echo what Reg said in that it's hard to imagine any individual demonstrating more commitment to public service than what the vice chair demonstrated in her service on the January 6th committee. My other note would be that she participated regularly. It is not uncommon for members to participate in depositions. It's happened in recent investigations in the House Judiciary Committee, House Oversight Committee. I remember members participating in my very first investigation that I worked on, looking at campaign finance practices in the Clinton administration.
my reporting is that she had a key role, especially in deciding what the message should be. And I'm not saying that anyone had, everyone was involved. This is a committee that I think was everyone was functioning with a lot of muscles, very engaged, all the members, which I think sometimes is hard for staff when the members are figuring things out themselves. But my reporting is that she had a lot to do with this idea of who is the audience that is the most important here. It is Republicans and independents. We need to clear these minds and tell them what we believe happened. This is where, if we're going to really affect how January 6th was seen, we believe Democrats already see it the way most Democrats in the House see it, what we've heard from them. But she, I think, really voiced behind the scenes, this is a group of Americans that we need to really connect with. That was, I think, something she wanted to do.
Chairman Thompson deserves a tremendous amount of credit as well for allowing the vice chair to play that kind of a role, and for some very important decisions he made early on about the use of subpoenas, doing depositions on video, the structure of each of the hearings, the rulings that were made to go after people for contempt, and the like, all of which were really big decisions. And I think it's rare to see a leader get all of those decisions right, time and time again. And I thought that was extraordinary. I'm sure he had good advisors, but it's up to the chair to decide whether they're going to listen or not. And I thought his leadership, also deserves a lot of praise.
Yeah. All right. I want to shift the focus, sort of behind the scenes now, to the National Archives. So most of us don't think about the National Archives all that much, but they became a very important part of this investigation. The committee sought information from the National Archives. Maybe that's happened before, but it certainly got a lot more focus this time. So I'd love anybody to comment on, what happened. And do you think that's something that's going to happen more and more as we move forward? Dave?
Sure. I'd say there's part of it that was novel and part of it that wasn't. So our committee, the Oversight Committee, had jurisdiction over the archives and the Presidential Records Act. And the PRA has a specific provision that lets committees request documents from previous administrations. It also has a provision to notify the previous president in case there's some assertion of privilege. That part is not novel. I think what was novel in this case was you had a former president trying to assert a privilege and a current president not, and that was litigated. But in terms of going to the archives for information, that's more of a routine thing than I think most people think. I think the coronavirus committee also did that. And I know on the Senate side, when they're doing nominees, say Supreme Court justices that previously worked in the White House, documents will be requested from the archives there and they'll be sent over. I would just like to flag one thing, which I see Steve Katz here. He's flagged that the archivist, the nominee for the archivist, did not get through in the last Congress. And so that's a really critical position, not just for this information, but now we have additional questions about handling of classified documents. So that should be a focus for the Senate coming up.
I'm actually worried, as somebody that cares a lot about the executive branch and the ability of a president to get candid advice. the decision around whether or not the current president or the former president controlled the privilege and whether or not it ought to be waived, I think will have long-standing implications, and there may be a tit for tat kind of impulse here. But presidents need to be able to hear really raw, really candid advice, and there is some value to knowing that that advice is going to be secret or confidential for at least a long period of time. I think it's going to impact what people write down and what they say. That's not to say that those privileges aren't being vitiated by tell-all books and lots of other kinds of things, but I worry about that and the role of the archivist over time. Obviously, that decision was decided between the two administrations. I'm not 100% sure we got that right.
Can I just respond? I agree that there should be an expectation of privacy for advice to the president, but executive privilege is not absolute, even totally separate from the archive process. In this case, a federal judge has said that Trump and his aides likely engaged in criminal activity, and that can pierce executive privilege. And in this case, it's hard to imagine a case where it wouldn't have.
So I mentioned earlier, or we've been talking about really the system of oversight, and obviously it's really an ecosystem. There, focuses often on Congress, on the executive branch, but also the media and the public. And one of the ways that was really expressed, I think, in this process was the control room. First ever effort to have a control room really coordinate and execute all the technical matters around conveying these hearings. I want to hear all of you or any of you want to comment on what that process, maybe starting with you, Kristen, because you were present, what that process was like, and what do you think? Do you think that sort of technique is going to be used in the future?
I think whether it's used in the future is really a leadership decision that similar to decisions members who are in leadership make about allocation of resources that members are demanding, like when members demand access to SCIFs, places where people can consider classified information. Often there's competition among committees and members for access. So I think whether that there's a appetite for use of a control room is a question that has yet to play out, and there'll be considerations that leadership will have to take into account in how to manage that.
I like to say everything I need to know about congressional hearings I learned at Carl Levin's PSI committee. I kind of think maybe the control rooms are more formal now, but they've existed for a long time, and it might be the staffer whispering behind the scenes. I remember having a matter where I had a witness who did not have a larynx. And so he testified using a machine. And it was pretty jarring to see the machine read back the words in a computerized voice. And I saw members ripping up their questions and deciding that they were going to leave this guy alone. And I felt finally got one in there. And that was a control room decision, more or less, about whether it would be disruptive to the flow of the narrative that people wanted to tell. So I think it's, technology is driven in a particular way, but I don't know that I think that is in itself a massive innovation.
But it's bringing, though, people who haven't been in this process much in the past. I mean, professionals from other disciplines, broadcasting.
Well, the lighting was much better at this hearing than any other, and the size of the room.
Good teleprompter. A lot of people didn't see it. It was in a good spot.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's exactly right.
So it's going to be a matter of resources and capacity going forward. Dave?
And maybe just like space. I don't know about the palatial offices over on the Senate side, but on the House side, if you've seen these hearings, the members go off to a side room or in the back. And if you've ever been back there, there's a lot going on back there. They're holding meetings and taking calls and doing all sorts of things. So they would have to literally find physical space. I know Kristen mentioned the SCIF. every committee wants to have its own skiff, but it's a similar dynamic. Are you going to really find the space and the resources and then keep it up with all the, software upgrades and everything? So
I think it depends on the material. I think that I was talking to someone involved with the committee this morning, and I think that there were just so many kind of stars that aligned in terms of the kinds of material, the amount of witnesses, the amount of video, the stories they were telling, and there being sort of a cohesive argument that this one committee wanted to make. I think we could see it before, but I think it was special to this committee, the way that fell in line. And should another event like this happen, should there be another investigation like this, sure, I could see it. But I think it is, there were unusual things happening here.
All right, I want to shift gear. We're not out of time yet, but I'm starting to feel the clock. I want to get to a couple more things. One of them is criminal contempt. Last year and now this year is the first time in many, many years there's actually been prosecution for contempt of Congress. I'd like your comments about that process and whether we're going to see more of these kinds of prosecutions, more efforts to enforce subpoenas through criminal prosecution. I don't know who wants to.
I'll take it because it'll be my clients that maybe the ones facing it. Look, it's one thing when the people in charge of the inquiry and the people in charge of the Justice Department have the same political affiliation and or the same view about what is and is not appropriate, because the executive branch makes an independent decision, I believe, about whether or not it's actually going to follow up on the referrals for contempt. And I think that's an important authority. We're going to probably see a fair number of referrals for contempt in the new House as they ask for things that the executive branch doesn't want to provide. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not there's a willingness to go along with contempt and to bring the cases. My hunch is there won't be. So it may be that there was a unique alignment of political and legal interests that allowed for that to happen here that won't be present elsewhere.
I don't want to comment on the pending cases, but just for some historical context, I guess the last prosecution that was brought by Department of Justice for criminal contempt of Congress was in the 80s with an EPA official. That was unsuccessful, although she was convicted of lying to Congress. But before that, the last successful prosecution for criminal contempt, I think, was during Watergate. It's probably G. Gordon Liddy or around that time frame. But I will add that the Trump administration, based on my experience on the House Oversight Committee, engaged in unprecedented obstruction of investigations across the board. If you remember, he went out on the White House lawn and declared, we're going to fight all the subpoenas with no sort of substantive basis at all. And that was only 3 or 4 months into the Democratic control of the Congress. And obviously it continued on from there. So to me, the contempt citations are not the unprecedented action. It was the obstruction.
There are a few places where people who weren't in the executive branch, Steve Bannon kind of comes to mind, asserting executive privilege, seemed a little edgy. But in general, you had a very different view of the executive power that was being articulated by the Trump administration. I don't believe it was outside of the norm in many instances of what the executive branch has asserted in the past. If you go back, there's an OLC opinion that says what you want it to say if you were in the executive branch. And the way they got around those was to say this was unique. So I don't fault the administration for having a robust view of the executive power, except, again, at the margins with some of the claims that were really, really frivolous. And to his credit, President Trump did not assert executive privilege over, for instance, the conversations he had with the acting attorney general as a lawyer talking to the president. And he allowed those conversations to be shared with the committee without sending it to the courts. So it's a complicated narrative, I think.
Anyone else? Well, it's now 1:00, and I try to keep my promises. So I think we have microphones for members of the audience who want to ask a question. I'm going to stand so I can see you. Is on? No. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
Hello. I just, you guys have said a number of times that it's been a very effective committee, and I wondered, did you guys have any measurements of that effectiveness? How are you measuring it?
That's a fair question.
Sure, I look at it in terms of moving public opinion, which I think it did. Threats made and threats realized in terms of the response to contempt issues. The amount of material. I mean, this is not a small body of work that was revealed and prepared in a very, very short period of time. Imitation. There are two select committees that I can remember for the current House of Representatives: the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government and the Select Committee on China. And in some respects, they're imitating or following in the tradition of the January 6th committee. So those would be a couple of benchmarks for effectiveness.
I think we saw the viewership was strong, very strong. And it wasn't just in the live streaming and coverage as it was happening. We saw people coming back again and again to view different parts of the hearings in a way that we didn't expect, frankly. And I think the first hearing, I just looked it up, we had 20 million viewers. The NFL is still, way up here. But this is a congressional hearing, 20 million viewers. That is right out of the gate, extraordinary. And I think that they really kept people coming back to watch.
I guess I would add a couple. I think these have been mentioned, but the number of court rulings in favor of the committee's position, the sheer number of Republican witnesses from inside Donald Trump's inner circle. And I know we mentioned that there's this other narrative out there, but those other officials were invited. A lot of them took the fifth, and others just refused and claimed privileges. So it wasn't as if there was no opportunity for them. But then I would also add the committee's vast public disclosure in December of hundreds of deposition and interview transcripts, huge troves of documents so that we could all check its work. And I can just speak for myself, but when I read the final report, I was convinced that Donald Trump was the prime mover of this multi-part plan because the evidence was there. It backed it up.
Thank you all. If former President Trump or none of his inner circle ever faces any repercussions for anything that happened that day, would you still consider the committee and its work to be successful?
I'm not sure who can answer that up here.
Well, I am grateful that there was so much interest by the public. We had over 50 million independent viewers of the hearings. And I think the fact that the committee was able to provide its findings to a wide audience and had the ability to produce a voluminous report that provided transparency was a step forward.
I don't know that I accept the premise that there haven't been repercussions already, from this for the president and his inner circle, and frankly, many people in the president's inner circle actually stood up for the rule of law, particularly the White House counsel's office, which I think acquitted itself well under extraordinary circumstances where people had to face the decision of I don't agree with this, but if I leave, God knows what will happen. And they stayed and stopped some things that could have put the country in a very, very horrible place. But there have been repercussions already in terms of the president's stature and former president's stature and the like.
I would just from my perspective, I would add that we won't know for some period of time. I mean, part of this is historical. If you look back at obviously very important congressional investigations that have taken place, there was a congressional investigation into the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s, which did not, result. I mean, it was widely covered. It generated a lot of attention, but of course, we all know what happened in the failure of Reconstruction and what happened that followed that. So, and Watergate. I mean, President Nixon was pardoned, and so there was some accountability certainly surrounding that. But the chief actor in that whole drama escaped accountability, at least legal accountability.
The one area I'm worried about is I really do. You guys are right. The Capitol, you can see it from here. The safety and security and command structure around the Capitol and how things get decided and who gets to do what, whether it's the National Guard or the Capitol Police, that's a real problem. And when you looked at the back and forth between the mayor's office and the sort of states and the Defense Department and the Justice Department and the like, that is an issue because it wasn't as public that I'm very hopeful that at least privately people have done what they call an autopsy without blame to figure out what didn't work and what could be improved. And again, I'm sure it's addressed in the written report, but that is an area that I think whether you're on the left or the right, you want to ask yourself, could this happen again? You don't fix that. The answer is yeah, it could.
I think House Republicans have an opportunity because I know they plan to look into some of that, and we will see, the bar is high for that to be a serious investigation, and we'll watch, we'll see what they've learned. But they have said specifically that Park Police, Capitol Police, all of it, that we haven't had the full conversation about yet.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Steve Katz, and like a lot of the panel here, I spent years overseeing the federal government working for a variety of terrific people in the House and in the Senate. Let me just quickly express my admiration for Senator Levin and his staff and the Levin School and everything that's going on. When you work in the Senate, and Senator Levin, as I had the privilege of getting to know his brother as well, Sander, in the House, but to see people like Elise Bean, who's here today, and Linda Gustitis and Peter Levin, they were really the A-team. They were the people all the rest of us looked at as, this is how you do it. So the fact that you're bringing this legacy forward and you have members of the panel who worked for him, that's really not that common. There are people who stayed up there for years, but their staffs didn't stay with them for years. And they didn't insist on remaining with that subcommittee or committee for years. So this is a real legacy, and I really want to express my admiration. It's true, I wandered into politics having a master's in American history, never thinking that it would become so important in my work on the Hill. My very first investigation I led
if
was,
you could just maybe go to
I know,
a question,
really short, but into Holocaust records in the 80s, 15 years before Monuments Men, and I spent months in the stacks of the National Archives. You're absolutely right on the security issues. It felt like the Capitol Police had been red-shirted, and suddenly the Super Bowl was being played, and they weren't ready. As somebody with a background and focus on the archives, I just want to ask Kristen something. I always felt, and in my conversations with some of your colleagues, they recognized that this was not going to go on forever. And they needed to work as an investigative committee, not an oversight committee, and that the records they created and relied upon were really going to be the drafts of history going forward. Can you talk a little bit about how you managed that process? Because as Dave and I were saying the other day, the article on the footnotes that was in the Washington Post, I felt that really told a story, but the discipline and focus that you gave, and I'm sorry for the other comments.
So Dave has talked about this in some of his comments today, but over the course of both the hearings that the Select Committee put on and ultimately in the final report, the committee took great pains to show the basis for the statements and conclusions and findings that they were laying out for the public. Because after all, just like with the legislative process, congressional oversight ideally involves a dialogue between elected officials and the public that they're representing. And so, you saw in the committee record, hearing by hearing, when members talked about testimony they received, they showed clips and they released supporting documents. And similarly, in the committee report, the committee not only assiduously footnoted the various findings that it made throughout the report, but it made every effort to provide the public the underlying information so that the public can draw their own conclusions and evaluate the basis of the committee's findings.
Good question down front.
Thank you, panel. Can you hear me? My name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm setting up a new democracy program at McCourt. This is a silver lining process nerd question. There's a number of us here in the audience who worked with the Modernization Committee on the House side over the last 4 years. And it seems that there's a real opportunity to bolster the legitimacy of Congress simply if we can make the submission of things like video as testimony in committees routine, and that Congress is developing the technology and the production values to be able to do this. I'm wondering, do you see this as a possibility? I was home in New Mexico for much of the pandemic, and 3 of my neighbors randomly had testified on Zoom, and it just brightened their day, lit them up in a way that they saw themselves in their own democracy in a way that just you can't ever have. It was unprecedented. And I'm wondering, like, that's something that really we need for the consent of the governed, and it might be something we can carry forward. How do we push that or advocate for that? Because any committee can do it. As you know, they all have their own rules and the discretion of the chair. So any ideas or hopes on that front?
You're in the wake of COVID, so you have, that experience that we've all gone through. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the new House rules actually went a little backwards and restricted the use of Zoom for testimony and that sort of thing without certain special circumstances. I think it can be used very effectively. It can really enlarge the number of people who can offer their testimony to a committee. So I personally would like it. It would have to be in the rules. And similarly, I think, as Lisa mentioned, the idea of videotaping depositions, if there's one of these innovations that I think might stick going forward, I think it's that, because the January 6th committee showed how effective it could be done. But again, it might have to be a conversation about the rules. Right now, the rules cover deposition transcripts, but they don't necessarily apply to interview transcripts, which are not depositions. So there has to be a discussion about both, I think.
I'm against this as a defense lawyer, although the rules do allow the chair to have the discretion to call non-government witnesses by Zoom. There's an important truth-seeking function that should be embedded in oversight. And one of the ways in which we further truth-seeking is an adversary system. And I have concerns that the due process rights for witnesses are frankly few and far between when you're dealing with a congressional oversight, because the judge and the jury are one and the same. And there is some risk with videotape depositions or Zoom testimony that you won't get the rigorous cross-examination that you would that furthers that truth-telling function. And you may end up having more witnesses decide to take the fifth if they know that every word that they say in a videotape deposition is going to live forever and may be used in collateral proceedings and the like. So I think the balance is frankly, still a little bit too far on the government side now, and going much further than that could raise some real civil liberties concerns for witnesses.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? No? Well, it's now one more question.
I actually just have a follow-up question.
Sure. Okay, and I'm afraid that's going to be after our last question. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to give some closing comments.
Can you force a witness to be videotaped if they don't want to be videotaped in deposition? Does that come up?
So the question, just for everybody, so everybody could hear that, particularly people online, is can you force a witness to be videotaped in a deposition?
I mean, obviously a witness has the right to take the fifth. And whether they can make them take the fifth on videotape, I don't think that issue has come up, at least not recently. Usually there are some levers because of the kind of headache that it would take to kind of go through the process where people reach an accommodation. I just think that as these things progress and the consequences are extraordinary, right? Anybody that got deposed that had some exposure on January 6th is going to be thinking about a prosecutor looking at that later. Those issues are going to come up again in the corporate context and the like. And so there are just a lot of equities to be weighed, and we should be mindful of all of them.
You know, not all of the witnesses were videotaped. You know, one that comes to mind was General Milley. And so my educated guess about that is that there were conversations. Now I don't know what the enforcement mechanism is or who has what kind of power in that, but I think there were at least some witness conversations about comfort levels and their preferences.
Okay. Well, we're now going to move to closing remarks, and I guess we'll go in reverse order if that's okay. Dave, would you like to kick things off?
Okay. Hold on 1 second. Okay, thanks again. I really appreciate the Levin Center and Georgetown for hosting this event. I'll just make 2 quick points. First, over the past week or two, House Republicans there have been press stories about whether the House Republicans will use some of these same tactics. So here's one: borrow the opposition playbook. House GOP weighs the ultimate tit for tat. And here's another one: House Republicans expected to soup up their Biden-centric investigations by taking pages from the January 6th committee's groundbreaking playbook. And I can understand why people are interested in those questions. But I think there's a bigger question. Yes, House Republicans may emulate some of the tactics and innovations that we've talked about today, and future committees and future Congresses might emulate them as well. But will they emulate what Kristen started off with, which is that collaboration and that putting of personal or parochial or political interest to the side and work together and do the really hard work that it takes to come to compromise and agreement and developing these sorts of innovations for the purpose of their investigation? So as these new chairs are just now embarking on their chairmanships, this is something that they might do well to consider. And the second point, if I may, as a longtime Hill staffer, I'd like to just say a word about congressional staff. They work extremely hard, both Democrats and Republicans, in very challenging environments and with sometimes very challenging personalities. And, a small mistake can be magnified with the media coverage. They rarely seek the spotlight, and they almost never get the recognition they deserve. So, Kristen, I know you're a friend, but that should not bias me right now. Let me just tell you all, Kristen is a sharp legal mind. She's a kind person, and she's one of the most patriotic people that I know. She and the others on her team made great sacrifices over the last 2 years, putting in incredible hours, nights, weekends. And so if I can, I would just, on behalf of Georgetown and Levin Center and everybody here, how about a round of applause for Kristen and her team?
That was not scripted.
That's not scripted. Well, actually, yeah, no, but no, congressional staff getting credit needs to happen far more often. I'm really glad you said that. When I think about this time, I think that we are living in a time where journalists and I think family members who are ahead of you will look back and wish they could be in the rooms that we're in. They're going to wish they could have the conversations that we're having. I think this is an important series of inflection points that are kind of clustered together right now. And I think and know that our country is paying very close attention. Voters of all stripes, all makes, all across the country. PBS, we're lucky in that we have one of the greatest reaches in rural America of anyone, because you could get us for the longest without going digital, and we have more stations. So I know that our country is paying very close attention. Passions are very high. That's because I think love of this country is very high. But that's why I think something like this is feeding a very real appetite for information about our democracy and what's happening. And so as a journalist, the more transparency, the more information, the better. And I think that this committee, especially on the latter end, in posting all of its transcripts, allowing all of the documentation, having this report 600 pages before you even get to the appendix, all of that is really critical. And I think it speaks to an appetite for Americans to hear and see their decision makers and the people behind the scenes more than ever. So I hope that we continue to see that. I do think that this was special in that we had a cohesive unit driving this committee, and that was important. I think we're in an era of very sharp continued politics, and it does worry me. I think the committee structures can be very useful. We will see going forward what happens with the upcoming House Republican hearings, which could get very heated. And that actually, we've seen political heat turn into real life violence. And it's something that's on my mind, but I know that's something this committee tried to present in a factual way. And hopefully that kind of tone is what we'll see ahead. I don't know if we will.
I'll add my voice to those praising the committee. Kristen got a call on a cell phone that she probably didn't think I had the number to immediately upon it being announced that she was on the committee staff, because I felt like that was somebody I could deal with in good faith, and her word would be her bond. And Tim Heafy and John Woods, it was bipartisan in terms of the quality of the staff, the expertise of some of the people that were looking at technical issues or following the flow of money and the like, was just top notch. And these are people who could have been doing other things. And the fact that so many of them were willing to put their other pursuits on hold and work together on this was extraordinary, and history's the richer for it. As to accommodation and compromise, that's the first refuge of the minority. It's just the political reality. Here we are, in fact, going to see tit for tat, as it were. In some instances, that may lead to more light, but maybe in more instances than that, it won't. It'll just lead to more noise, and I'm not quite sure what we do about that. I think it starts with leadership, and if there are a couple of things that I would take away from the work of the January 6th committee, it is the importance of leadership, the chairman and the vice chairman, the tone that they set. Chairman Levin always gave the minority the right to run their own investigations. In addition to the investigations he ran, he understood the importance and power of compromise. The man that you work for, who even though I don't agree with him politically, was a hero to me, was Elijah Cummings, who also engaged in compromise. And I know people on the other side of the aisle speak of him with great respect. So it'll turn in a large part on the leadership skills of both the majority and the minority going forward. But kudos, Kristen, to you and your team. You should be blushing, because what you did was extraordinary, and history will be very kind to you and your team.
Well, thank
How
you.
do you follow that?
I want to start by thanking my fellow panelists for the very kind words. And I would just say it really was the privilege and honor of a lifetime to work with such a dedicated and talented group of members and staff in my work on the Select Committee. And I also want to express my thanks again to the Levin Center and Georgetown Law School for the opportunity to participate today. I'll just conclude with one comment, which is that I'm really encouraged to see the large turnout of students in the audience today. And I think that the fact that the Select Committee had such a broad tent of professionals with different talents working on the investigation highlights that there are many different ways that smart, creative people can be involved in public service. And I would just invite students who are considering options for career paths to think about whether it's appealing to work on a congressional investigative staff or maybe ultimately as an elected member of Congress. But even for those who are not interested in pursuing that as a professional pathway, there are many ways that as private citizens, people can have an influence on congressional oversight, like by remaining current about ongoing congressional investigative work and reaching out to your elected officials if you have thoughts about what issues merit additional investigative attention or other ways that they can be doing effective oversight. So I hope that today's discussion spurs additional interest and conversations among students.
Well, thank you all. Professor Norris, did you want to say some final remarks?
Well, I just want to thank you all for coming. It's been a terrific panel, and I want to thank the Levin Center and Elise Bean and Jim for helping me put this together here and getting some students here. We brought some lunch in. Hey, that does a little bit of work. But I learned a lot today, and one of the things that I hope people take away from this is that people actually do work across the aisle in Congress. Despite our very divided world, I remember working for a guy named Biden on the Senate Judiciary Committee who routinely loaned me to Orrin Hatch. So in that spirit, I want to thank the bipartisan panel because we know things can get done here, and give them a huge round of applause.
Before we break, I have the final word. I want to thank Professor Norris and the whole team at the Georgetown Law Center for helping us put this together and putting on an amazing. I mean, this is a beautiful place to hold an event, and so we really, really appreciate that. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Levin Center, Elise Bean, who directs our Washington office, and Margot LePere, who's our program manager, who's back in Detroit, did excellent work to put this all together and assemble this incredible group. So I want to thank them in particular. I want to thank our panelists for your insights and for your time. I spoke of the oversight ecosystem. Well, this is a pretty good representation of that ecosystem. The government, the media, and the public, Reg being the person who represents members of the public, I suppose. It's very, very important that we get that combination. We've helped people understand that this conversation is what is really at the heart of our democracy, and oversight is at the heart of that conversation. And what we really heard today was that this is about good faith. We've got to demand good faith from our elected representatives. And I was struck by, Dave, it was your comment about Leader McCarthy's conditions for participating in the special commission that was considered to look into the January 6th attack. Those are the things we at the Levin Center teach. Bipartisan balance and following the facts wherever they lead, and giving people equal time. That's what we support, and we hope that that kind of good faith, even when there's a lot of partisan rancor and disagreement, can be something that the public demands. Because if we don't have that, then it's really hard to have fact-based investigations if people don't act in good faith. And lastly, I would just say that if we appreciate the coverage here. This has been broadcast live on C-SPAN. I'm sure a recording will be available on C-SPAN as well as on our website at the levin-center.org. And if I may be permitted a plug, on February 8th, we're going to have a panel on the developments in case law related to Congress's capacity to obtain information. There's been a lot of litigation in the last couple of years related to this, and this is the second one of these panels that we've had over the last few years looking at these recent cases and their implications for the future. That's on February 8th at noon. It'll be virtual, so go to the levin-center.org for that. And with that, I want to thank you all again. I want to thank our panelists. Another round of applause, please. Have a good afternoon.